Hey, this is Ryan Kopka and Mitch Peterson, and we research preseason injury prediction using an FMS or functional movement screen score. All right, so our research issues. Most of you know many athletes are at risk of injury, and this is because of the irregular movement patterns that are involved in sports. Athletes are hurt all over the world and prevents them from accomplishing their dreams. Mitch and I both had career-ending injuries in baseball, actually, and this was why we have such a passion for this topic. So this had an impact on us when we were deciding what to research. We both had the question regarding if our injuries could have been prevented, and we believe it could have with the FMS test.
We found a number of articles that had to do with FMS scores and how they correlate to injury in a competitive season. But this article in particular was about the reliability of a bunch of different studies. It compared 24 different studies that sought to test the reliability of it as a preseason screening for potential injury. And as you can see on this quote here, they found that the reliability was a valid measure for injury screening.
All right, so in this study, they took 46 professional football players that were on the active roster, and the study lasted about one season, so about 4.5 months. By using the FMS score, they wanted to determine the score of each individual player and correlate their FMS score to serious injury. You can see on the graph that those who scored 14 or above on the FMS test were less likely to have a serious injury during the season, and those who scored less than 14 were much more likely to encounter a serious injury. These tests were taken before the season.
Here we see another study that aimed to use the FMS as a reliable preseason injury screening tool. The main aim of the study was to investigate the relationship between an FMS score and a history of injury and attempt to determine which active athletes are prone to injury. In order to do so, they recruited 100 physically active males and females with no recent major muscular injuries. And as you can see from this quote on screen, those with a score less than 17 were 4 times more likely to become injured in a regular competitive season. Theoretical perspective. The FMS test is a series of exercises that correlate to a score. As you know from our earlier points about numbers, 14 was the magic number in most cases, that anyone with a lower number than 14 was more prone to injury, and those with the higher score more likely than not would not be injured in the season.
All right, so the purpose of our study is going to be to evaluate athletes before preseason lifting. This will enable us to identify weaknesses and locate areas of the body that are at high risk of injury. This will enable us to make individualized workouts that will prevent career-ending or serious injury like me and Mitch's case. If we were to have an individualized workout scheme that would build up our rotator cuff muscles and our shoulder muscles, that could have prevented us from our seasons ending a lot shorter than we would wished. So these are some of the research questions that we want to answer. So the first one is we want to make sure that the FMS test is accurate. We also want to see the FMS test score and if it really correlates with serious injury. And based on each sport, is there a difference in regards to the FMS test correlating to serious injury? And is there a significant difference between the genders?
Alright, so our hypothesis, we believe that the FMS test is a good predictor of injury, and if taken in the preseason, many athletes could build programs around their weak spots, which will be shown through these FMS scores, and those with a score higher than 14 would be less prone to injury, and those lower, we would assume, would be more likely to be injured during the season. Our methods section here. Like I said before, each test will be taken in the preseason. A questionnaire will be given out for background info on past sports injuries, and if possible, we would like the sample to consist of those without any previous major injuries. The sample size would preferably be 3 males from soccer, baseball, football, hockey, and 3 females from softball, soccer, hockey, and track. We would run a qualitative correlational test. Some of the instruments that we would use would be the FMS test kit, which includes everything needed in order to analyze certain movements, and Microsoft Excel, which would be used to find our p-value and run a correlational test.
All right, so this is data collection procedures. The FMS test includes 7 different movements, and the first movement is a deep squat. We analyze the athlete's lower extremities in performing this movement. This movement tests the athlete's total body mechanics. Then we move on to movement 2, which would be a hurdle step. So we can analyze whether or not the athlete has proper stride mechanics. This movement requires coordination and stability between the hips and torso. The third movement would be the inline lunge. This position will force the athlete to focus on and maintain balance and stability during rotational, deceleration, and lateral type movements. And movement 4 is a shoulder mobility test. This test will determine the bilateral shoulder range of motion. This movement also requires scapular and thoracic spine mobility. This would have been useful for both me and Mitch's case. Then move to movement 5. We will have the athlete do an active straight leg raise. This movement tests our athlete's ability to dissociate the lower extremity while maintaining stability in the torso. Movement 6 is trunk stability push-up. This movement assesses the trunk stability in the sagittal plane while the upper extremity movement is being performed. And our last movement is a rotary stability test. This movement requires neuromuscular coordination and energy transfer from the one segment of the body to the torso. The trunk must be stabilized while the athlete has both upper and lower extremities in motion. And in each one of these movements, we will be having a rater or a judge watch the athlete's movements and score them from 0 to 3. The higher the score is obviously the less likely they are to injury. The lower the score, the more likely they are to injury.
For our data analysis, we're going to use a paired t-test. And the paired t-test is commonly used to compare a sample group scores before and after an intervention. And again, we're going to use Microsoft Office Excel to set up these charts. Here we see a few limitations to our study. The first would be that the reliability of the rater system in the FMS test, because the scoring is technically subjective based on one's own perception of how well the individual performed the movement. It's a relatively small sample size. Only collegiate athletes age 18 to 22, and we had no specific goals to determine the difference between men and women's scores. We were just looking for an overall score.
So the significance or the conclusion of our research would show that there is significant correlation between the preseason scores for athletes and an in-season injury. It would build the credibility of the FMS test. There's actually not a lot of data collected out there testing the FMS score. If proven credible, there are many implications in the field of sports. And even if physical therapy could be affected utilizing this test to help patients after surgery to analyze whether they are still prone to recurring injuries. And lastly, here are some references that we based our study off of.